In today's lesson, we are going to be talking about statistical questions, okay? First of all, we're going to define what is a statistical question. A statistical question is a question that can be answered by collecting data, and there will be variability in the data, okay? We might not know what that term variability means, okay? I'm going to explain that next. When we look up the definition of variability, we see that it means a lack of consistency or fixed pattern. Now that we have defined these two things, let's go ahead and give some examples, because right now it might seem a little bit confusing, but I think if we give some examples, it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, so let's take a look at some of these sample questions that I have written on this sheet of paper. On the statistical side, we have 3 questions. 1, what is the typical length of a movie in the theater? 2, how long do you usually spend in the shower? 3, typically, how many people attend the Super Bowl? All of these questions would lead to having variability or differences in the answers that the people you are asking would give. What do I mean by this? Okay. Let's look at question number 1. What is the typical length of a movie in the theater? If I were to answer this question, I would say an hour and a half. Somebody next to me might say an hour and 45 minutes. The person next to him might say an hour and 10 minutes. There is variability in the data because we all believe that there is a different answer to that question. Same thing with question number 2. How long do you usually spend in the shower? I usually spend 10 minutes in the shower. Somebody might spend 30. Somebody might spend 20. Somebody might spend 15. Okay? That's what I'm trying to get at, is that there is variability in the data that you are getting from asking this question to other people. There are also some key words that we want to pay attention to. These important words are the words typical, typically, usual, or usually. If you see these words in a question, there is a good chance that it is statistical. So thinking more about those 4 words, let's go ahead and take a look at 4 more examples of statistical questions and talk a little bit more about that. So for number 1, you have the word usual. An example of a question with the word usual in it would be, on a usual day, how many calories does a 6th grader consume? You might be thinking in your head of a number right now. And I can't guarantee, but my guess is that it would be different than the person sitting next to you, or in another class, in another school, in another country. Everybody's going to have their own answer to that question. Number 2 is the word usually. An example of a question with the word usually in it would be, how many fries are usually in a large container of fries at McDonald's? I don't know the answer to this question, but I would guess around 90. That's my number. What's yours? The 3rd word that's going to be a key word for statistical questions is the word typical. An example of a question with the word typical in it is, on a typical summer day in Iowa, what is the temperature? I'd say 85. That's my guess. The last word that we're going to take a look at is the word typically. Okay, an example of a question would be, how long does a dance recital typically last? I've only been to 1 or 2 of these, but I think they last at least 2 hours, so 120 minutes would be my guess. What's your guess in minutes? So you might be asking yourself, that's great, Mr. Peterson, I know these 4 words, but I still don't understand, how is a statistical question different than a regular question that I would ask my friend? And I'm going to go back to that word that we've been talking about, variability in the data. So let's look at a question that is not statistical to see if we can try to really grasp our heads around what I'm talking about. We're going to go back to this question we talked about earlier. How long is the movie Frozen? A quick Google search simply tells you that Frozen is 1 hour and 49 minutes long. There is no variability in the data here. I cannot say that the movie's an hour and a half long. I cannot say that the movie's an hour and 15 minutes long. There's no guessing. There's no variability in the data. There's no difference. There's no change. Okay? This is a single answer. Last but not least, let's take a look at a statistical question just to see one more example of a good example of a statistical question. What is the typical length of a movie in the theater? Okay, we talked about this question earlier, but let's figure it out. If I were to say typical length of a movie, I think I said an hour and a half earlier in this video. I would still say it's typically about an hour and a half. Hey Lauren, what's the typical length of a movie in the theater?
1 hour, 50 minutes.
Hey Spooky, what's the typical length of a movie in the theaters?
2 hours, 5 minutes.
Hey Ziggy, what would you say is the typical length of a movie in the theaters?
About 1 hour, 30 minutes.
So as you can see in here, we had some different answers to that question. That means that there was some variability in the data, therefore meaning that question must have been statistical.